There used to be a time in history where instead of just like going to the movies or going to the zoo for your weekend fun, you could just go and watch people in these like holding places for people that were considered mentally ill or the insane. Of course, at the time, these people were just treated like animals. It was essentially a zoo. People would just come over and instead of just, whatever you do in the weekend fun, they would just go and watch and pay to see people being chained up in these dark rooms. And maybe it would be better to describe it more like a prison. They would have these people like naked and scared, and guests could just come over and poke them, touch them, gawk at them, yell at them, sexually and physically harass them. And that was considered entertainment, which to me is just crazy that that's a time in history. But of course, as more time went on and more research and more of the public began to see how these people were being treated and how the mentally unwell were, people started to not like this anymore. And they kind of were like, yeah, that's kind of weird that we're doing that. And so they eventually stopped doing that. And that's when like psychiatric hospitals kind of began. Obviously, there's a way more detailed history of psychiatric hospitals, but we're not doing that for this episode.
That's next time. Pretty wild, dude, that they had people in these buildings like zoo animals.
Yeah, so like honestly, you could be someone who's just like depressed, or maybe you were schizophrenic, and they would just like chain you up to a wall, and you would just be in like a dark room, and you were just there. And usually, you were only there because you couldn't take care of yourself, and your family could just send you off there. And then people, no matter whoever, you didn't even have to know them, they would just come in and like watch you, like the way we treat animals at the zoo, except animals at the zoo now, hopefully, in most places, are treated with a lot of respect and with the care of the animal in mind.
What were the conditions for these people?
Oh, it's just like they were in like a dark room, like dirt.
Dirt?
Like, yeah, just like dirt. Like, you would just be like in a dark, think of a dungeon. Like, this is like the 1700s. So it's like
Oh,
dark. I don't even know how to describe it. Just like dark, dirty. You're just in a room with no sunlight and you're just chained to a wall, and you might be surrounded by other people that, maybe they're seeing things or they're just depressed like you. And then you just have these like random people coming in and watching you and grabbing sticks and poking you and watching you and making fun of you for maybe losing your mind.
shit. That's
Yeah,
wild.
it's honestly crazy. Eventually, like, more research did come, and eventually people were like, oh, wait, maybe we should treat these people like people and not animals. And then, as time went on, like, more research into mental health and psychology and even our, like, biology and everything about ourselves, people were like, oh, yeah, like, we should actually let these people, like, see the world and not just be chained up. Of course, like now, we're in such a better place with psychiatric hospitals, although there are still some places that are very sketchy. And of course, I'm talking from more of a Western point of view. But I want us to take a little trip back to the 1880s and talk about what women had to go through in these psychiatric hospitals, how horrible it was. Women could just be sent away to these psychiatric hospitals for any kind of reason. It could be grief, depression, postpartum. It could be that you're reading, or maybe you thought that it would be really cool if you could have the right to vote, or maybe you were a daughter of a feminist, or you just, maybe you talked a lot, or you had the flu, or anything.
You have the
You're
flu?
Yeah, like they could just send you away. Like if you just had the flu, they could just be like, "Okay, we're taking you to the doctor and you're gone." And like your husband could just send you away if he just didn't want you around. A lot of the reasons that husbands would do this is number one, they were terrible people, but they also could just take your assets. So if you just had like land, like maybe in your like father's name, and it was going to go down to you, if you were in the psychiatric hospital, it would just go to your husband. And so husbands would just like send their wives there, and then you would basically be there until someone was to come back for you or you die. A lot of these women were treated horrifically in these places. They would be beat, they would be yelled at, mocked, gaslighted. So many women that would go to these places were just normal people. Of course, there were most likely still people that were mentally unwell, but that's besides the point. Women would just be treated horrendously, and it was just horrific. And there was actually a woman who decided to go undercover in the 1880s, and she wanted to expose everything that happened to women in these places. And it was in a book called 10 Days in the Madhouse. And in this episode, we're going to dive in and see what she exposed. Welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm Jen. With me is Kira. In this podcast, we talk about all different types of things, whether it's true crime, mysteries, or anything that we just find interesting. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about 10 Days in the Madhouse, which was a book written by Nellie Bly, where she was a journalist and she went undercover into a New York psychiatric hospital called Blackwell's Island. And it was insane. Before we begin, I will give a little bit of some trigger warnings. We will be talking about mental health and abuse towards women that were mentally ill or just women in general. I also want to say, like, a little disclaimer. This was a case that happened in 1887, so it's important that we know that a lot of the information and knowledge of mental health isn't where it is now. And there is some dialogue and just conversations around the words like insane, crazy that we don't typically use now. If we do say that, I'm not trying to sound like an asshole. It's just a way to describe how she wrote it. All the information in this episode can be found in her book, which is 10 Days in the Madhouse. It will be linked in the description below if anyone wants to read it. You can read it for free. So with that, I think we can begin. So Nellie Bly was one of those girls. She was a little spitfire. At least that's how I would kind of describe her. She was born in a time where, women didn't even have the right to vote, and they really couldn't do much except just cater to the house. She didn't let that stop her. She was born as Elizabeth Cochran, but I'm going to refer to her as Nellie Bly, which was a pen name she eventually went by in her career. She was born into a pretty wealthy family. She had it really good until she was around 6 years old. Her dad had owned this mill and it was massive. He brought in a lot of money. They had a mansion. He also was a judge and her life was pretty good, but when she was 6, her dad had actually died and he didn't leave a will. I'm assuming he probably just died very suddenly and was not expecting it, but they had around 14 kids. So her dad was actually married previously and had 10 kids. But when he met Nellie's mom, Mary, he ended up having 5 kids. So there was not 14, there was 15 kids, which that's a insane amount of people, but that's kind of normal back then. Nellie, though, she loved pink. She was obsessed with it. She wore it all the time. Her literal nickname was Pink. And one thing that made me kind of sad was that she stopped wearing pink as she got older because she wanted to be taken more serious. Rest in peace, Nellie. You would have loved Barbie. I love Barbie.
Love Barbie.
Yep. Oh my god. Unfortunately, with her dad dying, they were not able to take care of this mill because they just didn't have the finances. And because of that, Nellie's mom had to go and do what a lot of women had to do at that time and marry a man for money. Obviously, she was not just like, I'm gonna marry him for money. She had 15 children to feed. She ended up marrying this guy named Jack. Jack was basically a walking red flag. Terrible, terrible dude. He was very drunk and abusive to Mary, and actually one night he pulled a gun out on Mary when Nellie was 14, just tried to kill her. And when he did that, Nellie and her brother got in front of their mom to protect her, and then they ran out of the house. Nellie actually went back into the house around that time to go get her siblings, but that's kind of the best way to describe Nellie is she really cared about a lot of people. She wasn't just one of those girls that's like, oh, like, ah, man, I feel bad for people. Like, she actually really tried to care for, like, the underdogs. Eventually, because of this, her mom went to court to get a divorce. This was around a time when women couldn't just get a divorce. Divorce was basically a sin. The only way you could get a divorce is if you testified out of, like, abuse or cruelty, which you can imagine how well that would go for women, considering you would probably have to show, like, physical abuse, and I can just imagine how many of these places would be like, take it with God, marriage is hard work. Nellie had actually testified for her mom and against Jack, and actually said that Jack was very drunk, and when he was drunk, he was very cross, and he was also cross when he was sober. Overall, this guy sucked. And luckily, her mom was able to divorce him. And because of this, Nellie kind of had to shape her. She was like, I'm not going to become dependent on a man. And she wanted to be very independent and just not rely on men. She kind of did what a lot of girls did at this time, and that was go to school to become a teacher. She didn't end up lasting because her family was just too poor, so she only lasted a semester. It kind of just made her really sad, but her and her mom ended up moving to Pittsburgh, where they ran like a boarding house and they lived near her brothers. Nellie ended up becoming a journalist. Her career kind of starts off really interesting. So when she was like 20 at the time, I think, or 21, there was this Pittsburgh Dispatch, which is a newspaper column. And it basically was a letter and then from an editor as well. And this guy had written to the newspaper basically saying, like, he was anxious that his five daughters hadn't been married and he didn't know what to do. And this editor responded with a title called What Are Girls Good For? Basically, this man would go on and write about how women were basically useless, that they had no role in society, and that they should just be baby makers, that them working is terrible. We should actually take what China was doing at the time and killing female babies. And that,
Bro.
yeah. And like, he was trying to be like, no, like, it's because like women have it so rough. Like, oh my god, it sucks. It's like, no, I think you just hate women, dude. Nellie saw this and she was like, mm-mm, I'm gonna write to this guy. So she made a response under the alias of the Lonely Orphan Girl. And she basically wrote this incredible piece about how women are just incredible, but that we need to care about the women that aren't, maybe considered beautiful or the best idea or what society loves. And she would talk about how women that were poor and how they had to actually work to take care of their family, and how more women just work more than men, and how men basically get everything, and how society benefits boys more than girls. And then after she kind of put that into the newspaper editor, he saw this and he was like, damn, she wrote that really good. So then he he wrote into the paper, like, whoever is this girl, come down to my office. And she did, and then he actually offered her a job. And that's when she went by the name Nellie Bly. She'd kind of go on at first to write very stereotypical girly pop things. She was like, I don't want to write about this. Like, I want to write about actual interesting things. So then she just took like a trip to Mexico with her mom and she wrote about the government for 6 months. And then she ended up moving back to Pittsburgh because she was like really anxious because like Mexican police and government were like, we don't like that you're writing about us. And she was really scared. So she went back and then she ended up going to New York. And that's kind of where our case takes place. And she gets hired by the New York World newspaper. And this is in 1887. And basically, they had a mission for her, like a question. And that
Okay.
question was, could she actually go to the psychiatric hospitals and like have herself, committed into one of these places? This mission was basically to have her write about how these patients were being treated. Nellie had actually had a quote from her book where she said, I always had a desire to know the asylum life more thoroughly, a desire to be convinced that the most helpless of God's creatures, the insane, were cared for kindly and properly. The many stories I had read of abuses in such institutions I had regarded as widely exaggerated or else romances, yet there was a latent desire to know positively. So basically, she said she really just wanted to kind of see what was happening because she felt like the cases she heard of people being like, treated like shit was just kind of, over exaggerated for effect. And so she wanted to see if she could pass off mentally unwell or insane and she could do this. So her instructions were very simple to go when she was ready and to write about the good, the bad, and the ugly. They told her to not have a narrative in her mind yet, that she just needed to kind of go and write as authentically. And she actually asked one of the people working there, like, well, how am I going to get out? Because, women couldn't just be like, okay, I'm going to leave now. Like, they didn't have the choice. And they just responded with, we don't know, but we'll tell them who you are and then we'll get you out. And honestly, that's enough for me to be like, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think I'd be too scared. She changed her name to be Nellie Brown instead of Nellie Bly. Basically, she said she wanted to keep her initials in case, things went sour and she needed to kind of prove something. That was kind of where she started. So she had two ways to get there. She said she could either have her friends or family like commit her to these places, or she could do it herself or get like the police. And she kind of chose the latter because she didn't want her friends or family to have to go through that like embarrassment of like having the police take her away, but she also didn't want anyone assisting her through it. So she was like, I'm just gonna like do it myself. So she ended up for like one single night, I think it was like only a couple hours. She stood in front of the mirror making a bunch of funny faces, like trying to act what I would say stereotypically insane. And she said she was even going to turn up the gas in her home to see if it would kind of make her delirious, but she didn't. And then she ended up taking on this persona of like this girl who came from Cuba and was needing to get some work and was lost and mentally unwell. So she ended up going to this like boarding house for working women. And her plan was to just kind of act as crazy and weird as she can and have these women call the police for her. So her persona, she pretended like she didn't know how to work. She had never worked before. She was acting very depressed and that she was almost like manic in a way, like like she was kind of going all over the place. And she said like this place was like very weird because she said like they weren't very nice people, but they were still trying their hardest to help her when she was acting depressed. She kind of went on like, "Oh, I can't work. Like, I've never worked a day in my life. I don't want to work." Which, like, honestly, if that's enough to get you committed to an insane asylum, I feel like my ass would be in one already. So, like, a lot of the women there were like trying to comfort her and be like, "No, you have a lot to live for." And then Nellie kind of would become very paranoid. She was like, "Oh my God, there's like murderers outside and there's crazy people in here." And the landlady that kind of ran this like boarding house, she was like, no, like we don't keep like any crazy people. And then Nellie that night didn't sleep and was acting very erratic, and she started to like kind of scare a lot of the women in the home. They were like, I don't like this girl, she's acting weird, she doesn't know where she's from. And so they ended up calling, well, they didn't call because I don't, telephones weren't invented yet, but I don't think they were. um but they ended up getting the police, and when the police arrived, Nellie was acting very stubborn and like she was upset, and then the police were like, no, like you gotta come with us. And she kind of was like going on about how she lost luggage. So they first took her down to like the express station to go and look for her luggage. And when she was there, the people working there were like, when did you come to New York? And she was like, I've never been to New York. Like, what are you talking about? And they were like, Miss Girl, like you're literally in New York. What are you talking about? And she was like, no, I've never been to New York. And so they thought that maybe like she was just like drugged and had amnesia or whatever. But she was like, no, like I've never been on drugs. Like I don't even know what drugs are. And so they were like, what the heck? And so there was a judge there, and he actually was like, I think we need to go get her checked out to see if she's really drugged up. And the police were like, we should take her to the island. The judge was like, I think we should just get some doctors and test her out and see if she's like drugged up because within a few days she should be back to normal. She ends up meeting with like four different doctors, and all of these doctors just were like, yep, she's mentally insane and she is a hopeless case and she needs to be taken away. Like, she's a lost cause. Like, oh my God, I can't believe this woman is even out walking around. So she was taken to this hospital, and when she was there, it was kind of like the holding place. So from what I gathered, what would happen is you would go to these hospitals, and then from here they would determine you insane and then you would be taken to a psychiatric hospital. And so while she was there, she actually met with a few different girls. There was one woman there who said that she was there because she was poor. Like that's literally the entire reason. She had applied for aid and then they were like, "No, she's mentally insane." And she had went through like a lot of like hardship and she probably was just like depressed or something like that. And they were just like, "Yeah, she is insane." And this girl kept trying to be like, "Can you just test me for my insanity?" And they were like, "No, we're not going to do that." And there was another girl named Tilly, and Tilly we'll talk about throughout the episode, but she was like very sick, like physically sick. And she had been brought to the hospital by her friends, and she was already declared insane, and she didn't even have any testing done. And she was like to the doctors, "Can you have me tested?" And they would not test her. And she was like, "What is going on?" And so Nellie was like, "That's like so weird that they won't even listen to these women." Nellie was then considered insane and was now being sent to the Blackwell's island. Right before she went, one of the things I found so interesting was that they were all getting into like a carriage to get down to the docks to go to the island. And there was like a bunch of reporters there. There was a bunch of people. And when they were getting to these carriages, people were like yelling at them. Kids were chasing after them. And it's like they just kind of like still at this time looked at people that would be considered mentally unwell as like entertainment in a way. This kind of caught wind of the media. They would go on to write about how she was like this pretty insane girl because they were like, "I didn't know like a pretty girl could be crazy." Like it's like, okay. She gets to Blackwell's Island and she says one of the first things she notices is the lawn is absolutely beautiful, which contrasted to the women there who were very depressed. They looked hopeless. She said that the smell was terrible. What she found out was from the kitchen, and we'll talk about the kitchen in a bit. But Nellie said she was like kind of anxious when she first got there because she was like, I got declared insane by 4 doctors. Like, and she knew that she was going to be free within like a week or so. But she was like, but what if they don't come for me? And, she like being locked away. And like, this is kind of like no one in the hospital like they didn't know like she was undercover because like she was there as a patient. It wasn't like they talked to anyone. And so she said she was like really nervous, but she dropped her act immediately of acting crazy. And she said they didn't notice. Like the more she was herself, the more they were like, "Yep, this girl's crazy," and they would write it down. If she talked about anything, they'd be like, "This is a symptom of mental disorder." She's just like, "That's crazy." A lot of people there had actually saw Nellie and they were like the patients were like, "You're not supposed to be here, like I can tell." So she said like she thought it was interesting that some of the women there were like, "You don't look insane." She had a notebook and they actually took it away from her, which was very weird because she said like at first she kind of mentioned it that they took her notebook and she was like, "Hey, is it okay if I have my notebook, because I like to write down?" And they were like, "No." And so she asked the head doctor about it like a few days later and he was like, "Okay, I'll like try and get it back for you." So then when she asked him about it again, he was like, "You never came with a notebook," and like just straight up gaslighted her. And she was like, "No, I did." And he was like, "No, you didn't." And she was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I didn't." Like, what? The rooms were very, very cold and the windows were open. And a lot of the girls there were like freezing, like legitimately cold. She said that they looked blue. And these women would like tell Nellie like how they were so cold and they needed more clothes. They were basically wearing like shawls. And Nellie was like, "Why don't you just like tell a doctor?" And they were like, "Yeah, we can't do that. The nurse will beat us if we do." And Nellie was like, "What?" And actually, if Nellie would go to like a doctor about anything, the nurses would literally get mad at Nellie and like call her like a bunch of derogatory names. So it feels like the doctors definitely knew what was happening, but the nurses were more of like the evil aspect to this.
Mhm.
And also, they had like the windows open, like I said. And when they asked them, like, "Hey, can you close the window?" The nurses were like, "No, we don't do that." It's like, what? Like, and this was like September, like late September, and they're on an island, so like it's cold. A lot of the women were pretty like obviously sad. Some of them looked very hopeless. They would talk or laugh to themselves or cry, and everyone had to walk in a straight line. And she said that like a lot of the women would have to sit on these like hard steel benches, and sometimes like they would have to sit straight, like facing forward with nothing. Like they couldn't read, they couldn't talk, they couldn't do anything. And she said like sometimes these girls would like try and like move their legs or sit sideways because they're bored. And the nurses would just like come out there and like fix them and be like, no, you're sitting straight. Nellie said, like, the best way to describe this is like, how else would someone not go insane when you're forcing them to sit from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. on these benches with nothing? She was like, women are going, anyone's gonna go insane after doing nothing all day. Like, you have no stimuli, you have nothing. I just can't imagine, like, she was like, this is like a place where women were coming to be cured and they're just being tortured in a way. And the days were just like never ending. They, again, couldn't talk a lot. She said, like, if there was like a small event, they would kind of use these events in their day to talk about something. But even then, they would be like, they had nothing to talk about. And a lot of the women that were there, a lot of it was just bullshit reasons, like they're sick or they just think they're insane. One woman was there, like I said, because she was poor. There was another woman there who was a cook, and she was like a very neat person. And someone had made a mess in her kitchen, and she got really angry. And then, because of her anger, she got sent to the psychiatric hospital, which is insane because, like, the amount of men that should have been in these hospitals then. But of course, like, women, they can't do any of that. So the food was horrendous. She said that the food they had was like bread and prunes, spoiled beef, slop that was supposed to be broth, and they would basically get like bread that's like dried dough. And sometimes it was moldy and the water was undrinkable or dirty. And then they were given this like large bowl of pink stuff that was supposed to be tea. But she's like, yeah, that's not tea. And it was absolutely disgusting. What they were given for, to spice up their food was mustard and vinegar. And she said, yeah, that made the food taste absolutely worse. If the women refused to eat this food, the nurses would come in and just beat them. And Nellie said, like, sometimes the women struggled to eat because some of them had bad teeth or no teeth. And they couldn't really eat because this meat was so hard. And it was just terrible food. She said, like, the food was the worst aspect to it because it was like women that were sick would get sicker from eating it. There was human waste around, there was rats running around. Overall, horrendous. And it was disgusting. But one of the things I thought that was so sad was there was a part where she talked about when she was walking and they walked past the kitchen and they could see all the fresh food, the fresh bread, the fresh fruits, grapes, and they weren't allowed to have that. And sometimes these cooks would come in with all that food and give it to the nurses in front of the starving women. And I just think that's like so torturous. And if they ever complained about the food, the nurses would be like, this is considered good charity. And Nellie was like, bullshit. So they also had really dirty baths. They would have to take a bath in ice cold water and they would have buckets poured over them and they were scrubbed very roughly. The water was never changed, ever. So women were sharing the same bath water once a week.
Ew.
And yeah, and so they were bathing in the same water. They also would have them sharing towels, and she said, like, some of these women had, like, open wounds or sores or anything. And she was like, and then they had to share those towels. And of course, disease would go around. It was just overall, like, disgusting. And Nellie said that she actually watched this one girl, Tilly, like I mentioned earlier, who was the sick girl. She had been forced to have this bath, and her hair was, like, really short and it was falling out. And she said to the nurse, could you like not scrub my head so hard? And the nurse just like told her to like shut up and just take it or it'll get worse. And then she just kind of got more sick from these baths and it was just horrible. And they really treated this girl really, really bad because Nellie said like there was a time when there was a doctor there. The superintendent had shown up with a doctor and he was seeing Nellie, and Nellie was like, I'm fine, but you guys should check on Tilly. She's really sick. And Tilly even showed up and was like, yeah, like, can you check up on my health? And they just wouldn't. And the nurses literally dragged her away. And Nellie said she could hear the nurse say, when she sees that the doctors will not notice you, you will quit running up to them. I just think that's terrible. And then Tilly just got sicker and sicker. After like she had this one bath, Nellie had asked the nurse if she could have a nightgown because she was wearing like a wet slip, and she said like she was so cold. And the nurse was like, yeah, no, you can't have one. And Nellie was like, could I? Like, I really like having a nightgown. And this nurse was like, no, this is a charity. You're even lucky to have this place. And Nellie kind of clapped back at her, being like, the city pays for this and people pay to this to make sure like the sick and the unfortunate people are taken care of, and you can't offer that. And this nurse would just respond with, "You can't expect kindness here." And then she was just like locked away in a room the entire night, and all their rooms would be locked. And Nellie said that kind of made her anxious because she was like, what if there's like a fire? Yeah, and so she was like, I'm kind of like, I don't like that. Like, what if there's a fire? All these women will just be killed. Because she was like, there's no way they're going to come in and unlock every individual door for these people that they don't even care about. And she actually like brought this up to one of the head doctors, and he was basically like, "Yeah, sorry, I can't really do much about that." And she was like, What? Yes, you can."
What do you mean?
Yeah, like, yes, you can. You can change the locks. And he was just like, yeah, I'll look into it. Like, they just really didn't give a shit. And so there were these women. They were called like the rope gang. It was these groups of women that would be walking, basically like tied up with these long cable ropes that were like belts around their waist, and there was like they were all like tied up together walking guarded by all these nurses, and these were like the women that were the most violent or suicidal. They were just treated worse than even the area that Nellie was at. So these women were very, like, she described it as them being very sad. They had like vacant eyes. They spoke meaninglessly, and she said they also were really dirty, that she could smell how they, like, how dirty they were, and she could see the dirt. And she actually had spoken to a girl before about where the rope gang would go to, which was this place called the Lodge. It was another section of this hospital where the women that were just considered, like I said, most violent or just most suicidal would go to, and they would be beat, they'd be choked, kicked, and if they ever like complained or anything, the nurses would be like, that didn't happen, you're making that up. And they would have like bars locked on the inside of their rooms. So typically they'd have the bars on the outside of the windows, but in here it was on the inside. The food was like disgusting. The food was worse than what Nellie was having. So that tells you a lot. The food that was in this one section was just worse than what Nellie was having. And she said like they were just eating like like dirt basically, and that there was like flies everywhere, and that these like nurses just, they just didn't care. And like they were just like horrendous to these, like, some of these women. Nellie said like while she was out on this walk, she had saw some of those women, and then she said she saw like these women just being guarded by all these nurses, and they were marching very slowly. And then she saw like around 52 women in these rope gangs pulling a heavy iron cart with like two women in it, and one of them was like screaming, "You beat me and I shall not forget it. You will kill me." And she would like cry, and she said like the nurses would like watch Nellie and like would like frown at her, and like they just didn't like her. And she was like, "What the hell? Like this is like horrendous." And she said it was like a thing that was horrendous. Like she said that's a thing she'll never forget. She said like she was looking at the lawn, and she remembered how when she was first there, she was like, "Oh, the lawn is so pretty. At least they can look at that." But they weren't even allowed. And she was like, "What is joy or comfort to these women when they can't even look at the lawn?" Or they can't even touch the lawn. And sometimes these women would like, collect leaves or nuts because, they're just so lonely or depressed and they have nothing. These nurses would just grab it and then they would just crumple it up and throw it away. And I feel like she described it best where she said the nurses would compile them to throw their little bit of God's comfort away. I just think it's kind of sad. Like, I know it's like a tiny little thing, but it's like when you have nothing and you look at, like, when you just like see a rock and you're like, that's a cool rock. And you just have someone like throw that away from you and like you get nothing. Like, she said it was like prison, except with prison, you at least had the chance of freedom. The worst aspect of it was Nellie said she saw a lot of the physical abuse and the beatings. They just would beat women for anything. She said when she was there was this new girl that showed up. She described her as being born silly. I'm not too sure exactly what that means. I'm assuming she probably had some kind of cognitive delay. But basically, this girl would go on to say that she was 18 when she was like in her 30s. And the nurses would kind of use this and would mock her and make fun of her, and they would like deliberately like just pick on this girl. and this girl would like yell and cry, and the nurses came over and they just pounced on her and they slapped her, they knocked her head, and obviously this girl would cry more, and the nurses would get mean and they choked her, like straight up just choked her. And then they took her away to a closet and then she was just quiet. Nellie said she saw the same girl later where she had a bunch of bruises around her face and her throat. They saw an older woman being beat after talking to herself. And Nellie said like she wasn't even doing anything. She was just like quiet and she just was beat and then taken to the closet as well. And then there was this one woman, I think this was so sad. She was a French woman who her entire family was in France and she was in the States and she got like sick. And when she was brought to the hospital, the officers were like, "Yeah, she's insane." And they took her away. And she said that when this girl first got there, she cried and then she was choked until her throat hurt. And she said it had been hurting ever since. And there was another woman there who actually took like the bowl of tea that was disgusting and she flung at the nurse who had actually beat her previously. And that girl was then beat and then taken to the rope gang. Another one, I thought this was so sad. This girl, she thought she saw her husband while she was in line, while they were out for a walk, I think, or something like that. And she went to go greet him. And because she got out of line, the nurses grabbed her and they beat her with a broom handle. They jumped on her and they wanted to injure her internally so she would never forget what she did. And then they tied her hands and feet together and threw a sheet over her head, twisted it around her throat so she couldn't scream. And then they put her in a bathtub filled with cold water. And then they held her under until she gave up. And then they kind of took her back and then they grabbed her by the ear and like bashed her head against the floors and the walls. And they pulled her hair out of the roots so that it would never grow again. And Nellie said she didn't see all that happen, but she heard that from the girl. But the girl had actually showed her the proof of all the hair, everything. And Nellie was like, "What the fuck is happening? That's insane." There was some nurses that were nice, but Nellie said majority of it was just these nurses that were just evil, and they would kind of hide the abuse if these girls ever had a visitor so that they looked like they were being taken care of. And the more these nurses would beat women, the more they would just beat other women because they would kind of like get it in their system.
Oh my God.
Yeah. After spending around like 10 days though there was a lawyer who showed up and he basically told Nellie that her friends were wanting her to come back and that if she was willing to go, she could leave. And so Nellie is like, "Yes, get me the fuck out of here." And she leaves. She was kind of sad to like leave some of the women behind because there were so many women there that were like sane and she knew she needed to make something right about this. So that's when she would begin to write this expose. And at first, what happened was she was brought in for an investigation towards this island, this psychiatric hospital. And she was summoned to appear in front of a grand jury. And she agreed to do this because she was like, "I need to help these women." She basically was like, if I can at least help these women get, better clothes or have better food or just anything, then she's like, "I want to help them." So she went before a jury and she told them everything, her entire story. After they heard this, they went to the island to go and kind of like question the doctors, the nurses, and also see the other women there. The first time she went to this island, the boat was dirty, but when she was going this time, it was very clean, and she was like, "That's kind of suspicious." They had actually gone there and they were questioning the nurses, and of course, the nurses are like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about. That never happened." And they were just like, "Yeah, she's lying." But the superintendent, he was there and he was kind of like, "Well, I didn't know exactly how bad the treatment was, but I knew it wasn't good and I knew the bathing was terrible and the food wasn't good. But it was only like this because we didn't have a lot of funds." And get this, a lot of the doctors should not have been doctors. They didn't have a lot of funds apparently. So the doctors they were getting were just like shitty doctors. I don't even know if they were really real doctors. Some of the patients were examined by the jury. The girls would agree to kind of share what happened. And they, of course, also visited the kitchen. And what do you know? The kitchen is super clean. They got fresh bread, the whitest bread you can think of. All the food is fresh. And And Nellie was like, what the hell? And then Nellie was also like, a lot of the women were not there and she did not know where they were. So I don't know if those women were like, if they put them in different places or if they actually got them out. But yeah, but luckily, like one of the good things that came out of this was the jury report brought in $850,000 to increase their budget, which was roughly around now would be like $28 million in USD.
Oh
So
my
yeah, so like that was really good. And they decided to ensure that there would be future examinations that were actually for like people that were seriously mentally unwell and not just people that were just, oh, they have a flu. But she said, I left the insane ward with pleasure and regret. Pleasure that I was once able to enjoy the free breath of heaven. Regret that I could not have brought with me some of the unfortunate women who lived and suffered with me, and who I am convinced are just as sane as I was and am now. And yeah, that's the horrible story of the 10 days in the madhouse. I'm curious to know what everyone's thoughts are on this. I will leave the book in the description below, and yeah, we'll see you guys in the next episode.